They say wisdom comes from watching civilizations rise and fall across the galaxy. I've seen empires that spanned 1,000 worlds crumble at the first sign of real adversity. I've witnessed species with technology beyond imagination surrender when faced with impossible odds. I thought I understood fear, courage, and the delicate balance between survival and honor. Then I met humanity. What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about war, sacrifice, and what it truly means to fight for something greater than yourself. This isn't a tale of superior weapons or advanced tactics. This is the story of a species that looked death in the eye and smiled, that turned their greatest weakness into an unbreakable strength, and taught an ancient observer like myself that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the universe isn't the monster in the dark. It's the light that refuses to go out. I am Kethtar, Watcher of the Void, Chronicler of Civilizations, and for the first time in my 3,000-year existence, I felt something I thought was impossible for my kind to experience. I felt afraid. Not of humanity's enemies, but of humanity itself. The first time Kethtar laid eyes on a human vessel, he almost dismissed it entirely. The ship limped through the debris field of what had once been the proud Zalani defense fleet, its hull scarred and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen wounds. By all rights, it should have been drifting wreckage like the rest of the flotilla that had attempted to stand against the Devourers. The Watcher had positioned his observation craft in the shadow of a shattered dreadnought, cloaked and silent as always. For 3 millennia, he had recorded the rise and fall of species across this spiral arm of the galaxy. The pattern was always the same. A civilization would grow, expand, encounter the Devourers, and then silence. The dark ships that consumed everything in their path had never been defeated, never been turned back, never even been slowed. Until today, it seemed. The human ship, barely a frigate by galactic standards, moved with purpose through the graveyard of the Zalani fleet. Kethtar adjusted his sensors, curious despite himself. The vessel's energy signature was primitive, its weapons laughably outdated, and its armor appeared to be little more than reinforced metal plates. Yet it had survived when ships 10 times its size and 100 times more advanced had been torn apart. Interesting, Kethtar murmured in the ancient tongue of his people, his 4 eyes tracking the vessel's movement. His species had evolved beyond emotion eons ago, becoming perfect observers, chroniclers of truth unburdened by sentiment or bias. Yet something about this scene stirred echoes of feelings he had thought long dead. The human ship was not alone. As Kethtar watched, more vessels emerged from the asteroid field where they had apparently been hiding. 12 ships in total, all bearing the same primitive design and battle damage. They formed a loose formation, and the Watcher's enhanced hearing picked up their communications as they broadcast on unencrypted channels. Fleet Command, this is Captain Sarachun aboard the UES Defiance. The Zalani defense line has fallen. Estimate 40,000 enemy vessels moving toward the Kepler colonies. Request immediate orders. The response came crackling through the static of battle-damaged transmitters. Defiance, this is Admiral Harrison. All colonial defense forces are to fall back to the Terran system immediately. You're not, repeat, not to engage the enemy fleet. That's a direct order. Kethtar's interest peaked. He had heard such orders countless times before. It was the voice of reason, the wisdom of survival. Face the Devourers and you died. There was no shame in retreat when facing extinction. The Zalani had learned this too late, but perhaps the humans would be wiser. Captain Chin's response shattered that expectation. Admiral, with respect, we can't do that. The Kepler colonies have 8 million civilians still evacuating. If we fall back now, they'll all die. We're going to buy them time. Captain, you have 12 ships against 40,000. This is suicide, not heroism. Maybe, sir, but it's our suicide. Chin out. The communication channel went silent. Kethtar found himself leaning forward in his observation chair, all 4 hands gripping the controls. In 3,000 years of watching civilizations, he had never heard such words. The mathematics were simple. 12 versus 40,000 was not a battle. It was an execution. Yet the humans spoke as if the odds were irrelevant. The Devourer fleet appeared on the horizon like a dark storm consuming the stars. Their ships were organic in design, grown rather than built, with hulls that pulse like living tissue and weapons that fed on the destruction they caused. Kethtar had watched them annihilate the Zalani fleet in less than 30 minutes. 40,000 nightmares bearing down on 12 human vessels that should have been fleeing for their lives. Instead, the humans charged. It defied every instinct, every principle of warfare that Kethtar had observed. The human ships accelerated toward the oncoming horde, their primitive engines burning at maximum output. They were moths flying into an inferno, and they knew it. The first exchange came at extreme range. The Devourer's bioplasma weapons reached out like grasping tentacles, seeking to drain the life from their targets. The human ships scattered, their formations breaking apart as they weaved through the deadly energy streams. Several ships took hits, their hulls glowing red-hot where the alien weapons struck. But they kept coming. Kethtar watched in fascination as the human tactics revealed themselves. They weren't trying to win through superior firepower or technology. They couldn't. Instead, they were using their ships like guided missiles, each vessel targeting the largest Devourer ships in the fleet. They fired everything they had, depleting their ammunition stores in minutes rather than hours. The UES Defiance led the charge, Captain Chen's voice cutting through the battle chatter as she coordinated her tiny fleet. Remember, we're not here to win. We're here to make them bleed. Every second we keep them busy is another transport that escapes Kepler Prime. Make it count. The human ship opened fire with everything it had, kinetic rounds, missile clusters, energy weapons that sparked and flared against the alien hulls. The damage was minimal against the massive Devourer vessels, but it was damage nonetheless. More importantly, it was defiance in its purest form. Kethtar felt something stir within him that he couldn't identify. His people had purged themselves of emotion to become perfect witnesses, yet watching the humans fight stirred something primal and long buried. They were afraid. Their biosignatures made that clear, yet they charged anyway. The Devourers responded as they always did, with overwhelming force designed to crush resistance before it could spread. Thousands of their ships converged on the human formation, bioplasma weapons creating a web of death that should have vaporized the attackers instantly. But the humans had already moved. They weren't fighting like a traditional fleet. Instead, they fought like individuals who happened to be coordinating, each ship captain making split-second decisions that seemed to anticipate what their comrades would do. They used the debris field, the wreckage of the Zalani fleet, even the gravitational pull of nearby asteroids to create impossible attack angles. The UES Hammer, a heavy cruiser that had lost half its armor plating, suddenly emerged from behind a drifting Zalani dreadnought. Its captain had apparently been counting on the Devourer's sensors being momentarily blocked. The human ship fired everything it had point-blank into the command cluster of a massive bioship, its weapons punching through the alien's organic armor like needles through flesh. The Devourer's ship didn't die. Kethtar had seen them survive much worse, but it was wounded, its movements sluggish as biofluids leaked into the void. More importantly, it was angry. That's one. Captain Chen's voice crackled across the communications. 11 more shots to go. Kethtar realized with growing amazement that the humans weren't just buying time, they were hunting. Each ship in their formation was positioning itself for one perfect shot, one moment where their primitive weapons could actually harm their vastly superior enemies. They were trading their lives for wounds, but they were making those wounds count. The Devourers began to adapt, as they always did. Their formation tightened, cutting off the humans' hiding spots. Bioplasma weapons fired in overlapping patterns that eliminated escape routes. The net was closing, and everyone knew it. The UES Valor was the first to be caught. Surrounded by 6 Devourer ships, its captain made a choice that sent chills through Kethtar's ancient bones. Instead of surrendering or attempting to escape, Captain Martinez turned his ship toward the largest of his attackers and activated his emergency beacon. This is Valor. Going for the big one. Tell my family I made it count. The human ship's engines went to emergency power, pushing the vessel far beyond its design limits. Steam vented from ruptured conduits as the ship became a guided missile with a human well behind it. The Devourers fired everything they had, but the range was too close and the Valor too small a target moving too fast. The collision was spectacular. The human ship struck the Devourer vessel just below its primary weapons cluster, and for a moment, both ships simply hung in space, locked together. Then Captain Martinez activated his ship's self-destruct. The explosion lit up the battlefield like a newborn star. When the light faded, both ships were gone, and the remaining Devourers in that sector were damaged by the blast wave. 5 massive alien vessels temporarily disabled by one human frigate and the courage of its crew. "That's how we do it," Captain Chun whispered across the comm. "That's how humans fight." But the cost was becoming evident. The humans had destroyed or damaged perhaps 50 Devourer ships, an unprecedented achievement for such a small force. But they had paid for it with 7 of their own vessels, and the remaining 5 were badly damaged. The mathematics of survival were becoming undeniable. Kethtar found himself gripping his controls so tightly that his knuckles had turned white beneath his scaled skin. He had watched thousands of species die over the millennia, had chronicled their last moments with the dispassion of a scholar. But this was different. These humans weren't just dying, they were choosing how to die, and in doing so, they were achieving something impossible. They were making the Devourers afraid. Kethtar could see it in the alien formations, the way they had pulled back from the debris field, the hesitation before they advanced. For the first time in their history as conquerors, the Devourers were facing an enemy that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be broken, and refused to run. An enemy that treated death not as a failure, but as a weapon. The remaining human ships regrouped near the wreckage of the Zalani flagship, their formation tight and defiant. Captain Chin's voice cut through the static one final time, broadcasting on all frequencies so that both friend and foe could hear her words. "This is Captain Sarah Chun of the United Earth Space Force. To any survivors hiding in this system, to any ship that can hear this transmission, remember what you've witnessed today. Remember that 12 human ships stood against 40,000 and made them bleed. Remember that when someone tells you that courage is dead, that honor is meaningless, that the universe belongs to the strong and cruel. Remember that humanity was here, and we chose to fight." The Devourers resumed their advance, and this time, there was nowhere left to run. But Kethtar noticed something that chilled him to his core. The alien formation was different now, looser, more cautious. They had learned to fear these primitive humans, and their willingness to die for others. As the final battle began, Kethtar made a decision that would have been unthinkable to his species. He powered up his ship's transmitters and began to broadcast everything he had witnessed. For 3,000 years, he had been a silent observer, but some things were too important for silence. The galaxy needed to know what humanity was capable of. They needed to understand that 12 ships had just changed the course of an interstellar war, not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through something far more dangerous, an absolute refusal to let others suffer while they could still fight. As the last human ship exploded in a blaze of defiant glory, Kethtar whispered words that no watcher had spoken in millennia. "I am afraid. For the first time in 3,000 years, I am afraid. Not of the Devourers, but of what these humans represent. They have shown us that some things are worth dying for, and in doing so, they have made death itself a weapon." The battle was over. The Kepler colonies would evacuate successfully, saved by the sacrifice of 12 ships and their crews. But the real victory was something else entirely. The birth of hope in a galaxy that had forgotten what it looked like. And in the depths of space, an ancient watcher began to understand why he felt afraid. It wasn't fear of humanity's destruction. It was fear of their inspiration, fear of what they might convince others to become, fear of hope itself. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler, Kethtar found himself in a situation he had never experienced in 3 millennia of observation. He was being hunted by those he had studied. His transmission of the human sacrifice had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by quantum communication networks and whispered in 1,000 languages across 1,000 worlds. The reaction had been immediate and explosive. Some species had dismissed it as propaganda. Others had called it impossible. But a dangerous few had begun to ask questions that threatened the established order of galactic civilization. The hegemony, the coalition of advanced species that governed most of the galaxy, had issued a warrant for Kethtar's capture. His crime, disseminating seditious material likely to incite violence and rebellion among lesser species. The punishment was dissolution of consciousness, a death so complete that even memory of the offender would be erased. But Kethtar no longer cared about his own survival. The humans had taught him something his species had forgotten in their quest for perfect objectivity. Some truths were worth dying for. He had taken refuge in the neutral zone, a buffer region of space between the hegemony and the expanding Devourer territories. Here, among pirates, refugees, and outcasts, he watched the galaxy begin to change. The first sign came from the Kythera, a species of aquatic beings who had been enslaved by the hegemony for their ability to navigate hyperspace without technological aid. For centuries, they had served as living navigation systems, their minds linked to ships that carried hegemony officials across the galaxy. They were considered property, their intelligence acknowledged, but their personhood denied. Then, the Kythera Navigation Guild did something unprecedented. They went on strike. Every Kythera navigator across the galaxy simply stopped working. They released their mental locks on the hyperspace routes, leaving thousands of hegemony ships stranded in deep space. Their message was simple and devastating. We have seen the humans die for strangers. We will no longer live as slaves for masters. The hegemony's response was swift and brutal. Orbital bombardments began targeting Kythera-breeding worlds, designed to force compliance through terror. It was a tactic that had worked for 1,000 years, breaking the will of species that dared to resist the established order. But something had changed. The Kythera didn't break. Instead, they did something that sent shockwaves throughout galactic civilization. They began to sing. Every Kythera in the galaxy, whether free or enslaved, began broadcasting a hauntingly beautiful song across all communication frequencies. The translation was simple but profound. We choose how we die. Kethtar monitored the broadcast from his hidden observation post, watching as the song spread to other species. The Threx mining colonies began refusing to work. The Valdari servitor races started sabotaging their masters' equipment. Even the proud Zalani, survivors of their species' near extinction at the hands of the Devourers, began questioning why they served as mercenaries for the very government that had abandoned them. The humans, it seemed, had done more than buy time for refugees. They had planted a seed of rebellion that was growing in the most unlikely places. The second major development came from an even more unexpected source, the Devourers themselves. Kethtar had been tracking their advance toward the core worlds when his sensors detected something impossible. A Devourer fleet, nearly 1,000 ships strong, had stopped advancing. They hung in space at the edge of the Rigel system, their bioships pulsing with agitation, but making no move to attack the heavily populated world beyond. The reason became clear when Kethtar managed to intercept their internal communications. The Devourers, it turned out, were not a monolithic hive mind, as everyone believed. They were individuals connected by bioneural links, but capable of independent thought. And some of them had begun to question their purpose. The human sacrifice at Kepler had achieved something no military victory could. It had forced the Devourers to examine themselves. For the first time in their existence as galactic conquerors, they had encountered prey that fought not for survival, but for others. The concept was so alien to their nature that it had created a schism in their collective consciousness. A faction had emerged among them, calling themselves the Seekers of Understanding. They wanted to comprehend what they had witnessed, to understand how a species could value the lives of strangers more than their own existence. The Devourers had evolved to consume and grow stronger, but the humans had shown them something that threatened their entire worldview, the possibility that strength could come from sacrifice rather than consumption. The majority of Devourers still wanted to continue their advance, but the presence of the Seekers had created paralysis in their ranks. They could not move forward without unity, and unity was exactly what the humans had unknowingly destroyed. Kethtar documented everything, knowing that his observations might be the last record of these events if the hegemony found him. But he was no longer alone in his work. Other Watchers, members of his own species, had begun breaking their ancient vows of non-interference. They arrived at his location in hidden ships, bringing data and observations from across the galaxy. Kethtar had become the leader of something that shouldn't exist, a group of Watchers who had decided that some events were too important for mere observation. The humans have broken something fundamental, reported Watcher Veltani, her usually calm demeanor showing cracks of emotion that would have been impossible months earlier. The mathematical certainty of oppression has been disrupted. Species that have been enslaved for millennia are choosing death over submission. The probability matrices that govern galactic stability are collapsing. Kethtar absorbed the reports from 17 different star systems, each showing the same pattern. The human example was spreading like a virus, infecting the logical, ordered structure of galactic civilization with something chaotic and beautiful, hope. But the most significant change was happening within their own species. The Watchers had been created through genetic engineering and psychological conditioning to be perfect observers, immune to the emotions and biases that clouded judgment. They had served as the galaxy's historians and archivists for over 50,000 years, chronicling the rise and fall of civilizations with scientific detachment. Now, they were feeling, not just observing emotion in others, but experiencing it themselves. The sight of a human sacrifice had awakened something in their ancient, modified minds that their creators had thought eliminated forever: the capacity for empathy. "We must decide what we are going to do," Watcher Krelthon transmitted from his position near the galactic core. "The hegemony has branded us criminals. The Devourers see us as potential prey. And the species we have observed for millennia are looking to us for guidance we were never meant to provide." Kethtar considered their options. They could scatter, go into deep hiding, and hope the galaxy forgot about them. They could surrender to the hegemony and accept dissolution as the price for their awakening. Or they could do something no Watcher had ever done in 50,000 years of existence. They could choose a side. The decision came easier than Kethtar expected. The humans had shown them that some things were worth more than survival, that meaning could be found in sacrifice, that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. If the Watchers were going to feel emotions, then they were going to feel them completely. "We observe no longer," Kethtar broadcast to his fellow Watchers. "We choose to act. We choose to help those who refuse to accept oppression as inevitable. We choose to honor the example of 12 human ships that charged into the impossible and made it possible." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the galaxy, Watchers began emerging from their hiding places, revealing themselves to the species they had observed for so long. They brought with them 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge, the locations of secret weapon caches, the true histories of conquered peoples, the hidden weaknesses of the hegemony's power structure. More importantly, they brought proof that change was possible. If beings as ancient and seemingly immutable as the Watchers could be transformed by human courage, then perhaps transformation was possible for everyone. The first joint operation came in the Andorian sector, where the hegemony had been conducting genetic experiments on captured refugees. A combined force of freed Kithra navigators, rebel Zalani fighters, and Watchers with intimate knowledge of hegemony security systems struck the research facility with surgical precision. The attack succeeded beyond all expectations, not just because of the military victory, but because of what it represented. Species that had been enemies or strangers were working together, united by a shared understanding of what the humans had demonstrated, that some things transcended individual survival. Kethtar participated in the raid personally, abandoning his observer's role to fight alongside the people he had once studied from afar. As he watched Kithra and Zalani warriors cover each other's retreat, as he saw former slaves risk their lives to save strangers, he understood something profound about the human gift to the galaxy. They had not just shown others how to die with meaning. They had shown them how to live with purpose. The freed prisoners from the research facility included members of 17 different species, some of whom had never seen their homeworlds. But as they were evacuated to safety, they all shared the same expression: hope. For the first time in their lives, they believed that freedom was possible, that the established order could be changed, that courage could triumph over power. The hegemony's response was predictably violent. Orbital bombardments increased in frequency and intensity. Entire star systems were quarantined to prevent the spread of rebellion contamination. Propaganda broadcasts flooded the communication networks, declaring the human sacrifice a hoax, and the resulting uprisings the work of terrorists and criminals. But the damage was already done. The idea had been planted and was growing beyond anyone's ability to control it. Across the galaxy, beings were making impossible choices and discovering that courage was contagious. The Devourers, meanwhile, were fracturing. The Seekers of Understanding had grown into a significant minority, and their questions were becoming more troubling for their species. If consuming others was their purpose, why did the humans' willingness to be consumed feel like victory? If strength came from domination, why did 12 destroyed ships represent the greatest defeat they had ever suffered? Some Seekers began approaching the refugee settlements, not to attack, but to ask questions. They wanted to understand what they had witnessed, to comprehend how weakness could become strength and how death could become victory. The conversations were tentative and often ended in violence, but they were happening. Kethtar realized that the humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had forced their enemies to question their own nature. The Devourers were no longer certain of their purpose. The hegemony was struggling to maintain control through fear, and oppressed species everywhere were discovering that slavery was a choice they could reject. The galaxy was at a turning point, balanced on the edge of transformation or catastrophic war. The humans had lit a fuse with their sacrifice, and no one knew how large the explosion would be. As Kethtar compiled his reports and prepared for what he suspected would be his final transmission, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been an immortal observer, immune to emotion and dedicated to neutral documentation. Now he was a rebel, a criminal, and a believer in something he couldn't quite name. The humans had changed everything, and they had done it not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the simple act of caring more about others than themselves. They had shown the galaxy what was possible when fear was transformed into courage, when survival was subordinated to meaning, when the impossible became inevitable through sheer force of will. The ripple effects of their sacrifice were still spreading, and Kethtar suspected they would continue to spread for generations to come. The humans had given the galaxy a gift more precious than any technology or weapon. They had given it hope. 6 months after the first Kithara sang their song of defiance, the galaxy burned. Kethtar watched the destruction from his command ship, a converted hegemony cruiser that had been captured by the growing rebellion. Around him, displays showed real-time updates from 100 different star systems, each painting the same picture of civilization collapsing into war. The breaking point had come sooner than anyone expected. The Hegemony Council, faced with rebellions spreading across their territory like wildfire, had made a decision that shocked even Kethtar in its brutality. They had activated the Terminus Protocol, a contingency plan so extreme that many believed it was just a rumor designed to terrify potential rebels. It wasn't a rumor. The protocol involved the systematic destruction of entire species that showed signs of rebellion, not through conventional warfare, but through biological weapons that targeted specific genetic markers. The hegemony had been collecting genetic samples from every species they encountered for millennia, ostensibly for medical research. The true purpose was now revealed. They could exterminate any race that displeased them with surgical precision. The first targets were the Kithara. Their homeworld of Aquaticus Prime was struck with a bioweapon that turned their own water-breathing abilities against them. Within hours, every Kithara on the planet was dead, their gills dissolving from the inside as they drowned in their own atmosphere. The planet's oceans turned red with the blood of billions. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy the natural order. But something had changed in the galaxy's psychology during the months since the human sacrifice. Instead of terrifying other species into submission, the genocide of Aquaticus Prime ignited something that the hegemony had never faced before: righteous fury. The Zilani were the first to respond. Admiral Vextai, commander of the largest surviving Zilani fleet, broadcast a message that reached every corner of known space. Today they murdered a world. Tomorrow it might be yours. We can die on our knees or standing with weapons in our hands. The humans showed us there was a third option. We can make our deaths mean something. The Zilani fleet, 47 ships strong, immediately set course for the hegemony stronghold at Titan Station. It was a fortress built into an asteroid field, defended by over 300 warships, and thought to be impregnable. The Zilani knew they would die attempting to assault it, but they had learned from the humans that sometimes death was the point. They never reached Titan Station, not because they were stopped, but because they were joined. The first to answer their call were the freed Kithara navigators scattered across the galaxy. Hundreds of them had survived the genocide by being away from their homeworld, and now they volunteered to guide any ship willing to strike back against their people's murderers. They asked for nothing in return except the chance to ensure their deaths served a purpose. Then came the Threx miners, their industrial ships converted into crude but effective weapons platforms. The Valdari servitors arrived in hijacked luxury yachts and pleasure cruisers, vessels never designed for war, but crewed by beings who had decided that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Most surprising of all were the Seekers, the Devourer faction that had been questioning their species' nature. 50 bioships arrived at the rendezvous point, their organic hulls pulsing with colors that Kethtar's translation protocols identified as emotions the Devourers had never experienced before: grief, rage, and determination. Their leader, a massive creature that called itself thinking of others before self, explained their presence in broken but determined galactic standard. Humans showed us new way to be strong. Not take life to grow. Give life to help grow. We understand now. We come to give. The combined fleet that eventually assembled was unlike anything in galactic history. Over 1,000 ships representing 17 different species, united not by politics or commerce, but by a shared understanding of what the humans had taught them: that courage was contagious, that sacrifice could be meaningful, and that some things were worth dying for. Kethtar found himself designated as the fleet's coordinator, not because he had military experience, but because he had been the first to understand what the human sacrifice meant. The other Watchers had distributed themselves throughout the fleet, abandoning their ancient role as observers to become participants in the struggle they had helped to spark. The assault on Titan Station became legend before it was even fought. Admiral Vextai addressed the fleet from the bridge of her flagship, her words carrying across 1,000 ships in a dozen languages. We go now to face an enemy that believes fear is stronger than hope, that submission is wiser than defiance, that survival is more important than meaning. They have forgotten what the humans knew, that there are things worth more than life itself. Today we remind them. The hegemony defenders at Titan Station had every advantage: superior numbers, better weapons, fortified positions, and the backing of the most technologically advanced civilization in the galaxy. They should have won easily. They didn't. The battle began at extreme range, with the hegemony forces attempting to destroy the approaching fleet before it could close to effective combat distance. Their energy weapons reached out across millions of kilometers, targeted by computers that could calculate firing solutions faster than biological minds could think. But the rebel fleet wasn't fighting like a conventional force. The human example had taught them that victory wasn't always about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it was about making the enemy destroy themselves. The Kithara navigators guided the approaching ships through hyperspace micro-jumps that should have been impossible, so close to a massive gravity well. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, drawing fire from the station's defensive batteries and forcing the hegemony ships to choose between protecting the fortress and pursuing the attackers. The Threx industrial ships moved like giant construction equipment, which in many ways they were. Instead of trying to outfight the hegemony vessels, they focused on disrupting the station's infrastructure. Mining lasers cut through support structures, cargo haulers rammed into weapons platforms, and construction mesh rebuilt themselves into improvised combat drones. The Valdari, former slaves who knew the inner workings of hegemony technology, conducted surgical strikes against specific systems. They disabled shield generators, disrupted communication networks, and sabotaged weapons guidance systems with the expertise that came from being forced to maintain such equipment for centuries. But it was the Seekers who provided the most dramatic moment of the battle. Thinking of others before self led a formation of bioships directly into the heart of the hegemony defensive line. The Devourers had always been feared for their ability to consume enemy vessels and grow stronger from the material they absorbed. Now the Seekers revealed that they could do something else. They could choose what they consumed and what they rejected. As the hegemony ships fired their bioplasma weapons, weapons specifically designed to be absorbed by Devourer vessels, and turn them against each other, the Seekers did something unprecedented. They absorbed the weapon's energy, but refused to be corrupted by it. Instead of using the power to attack other ships, they redirected it into massive bioelectric discharges that overloaded every hegemony system within 1,000 kilometers. The effect was devastating. Dozens of hegemony ships found their computers fried, their weapons offline, their life support systems failing. But, more importantly, the sight of Devourers choosing to protect others rather than consume them sent shockwaves through both fleets. The hegemony forces began to waver. These weren't the enemies they had been trained to fight. Disciplined military units with logical objectives and predictable tactics. This was something new and terrifying. Beings who fought not for conquest or survival, but for an idea. The tide turned when the station's main defense grid went offline. A team of Zilani commandos, guided by former Valdari slaves and transported by Kithra navigators, had fought their way to the central control room. Instead of destroying the facility, they did something more devastating. They broadcasted everything. Every communication from Titan Station, every tactical discussion, every order to commit genocide was suddenly transmitted across the galaxy on all frequencies. The hegemony's carefully maintained image of benevolent leadership crumbled as species after species heard their masters discussing them like livestock to be managed or eliminated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the hegemony. Star systems that had remained neutral suddenly declared independence. Military units that had served the government for centuries began defecting en masse. Even species that had benefited from the current order started questioning their allegiance. But the most significant moment came when the station's commander, Hegemon Cordanus himself, opened a direct communication channel to Admiral Vextai. "Admiral, surely we could discuss terms. This conflict benefits no one. Order must be maintained, or the galaxy will descend into chaos." Vextai's response was broadcast across the galaxy, heard by billions of beings on thousands of worlds. "You're right, Hegemon. Order must be maintained, but not your order. Not the kind that requires genocide to preserve. We've learned from the humans that there's a different kind of order, one built on choice rather than fear, on cooperation rather than submission, on hope rather than despair. The humans are dead, Admiral. Their species will be extinct within a generation, if it isn't already. What did their sacrifice accomplish beyond inspiring others to throw away their lives needlessly?" The answer came not from Vextai, but from across the galaxy, as communication channels lit up with transmissions from human colonies, human ships, human voices. The species that the hegemony had written off as doomed was not only alive but growing stronger. The sacrifice of 12 ships had bought time for millions to evacuate, but it had also inspired humanity itself to become something more than it had ever been before. Humans were fighting alongside rebels in 100 star systems. Human engineers were designing new weapons based on principles of sacrifice rather than destruction. Human diplomats were negotiating alliances between species that had been enemies for millennia. The humans hadn't just saved themselves. They had become the catalyst for galactic transformation. Hegemon Cordanus' final transmission was barely a whisper. "What have we done?" Titan Station surrendered without firing another shot. The symbol of hegemony power, the fortress that had coordinated the oppression of countless species, was now in the hands of those it had sought to control. But Kethtar knew that the real victory wasn't the capture of a military installation. It was the transformation he could see spreading across the galaxy like a new form of life. The human example had evolved, becoming something larger than its origins. Species that had lived in fear for millennia were choosing courage. Beings that had accepted their fate as inevitable were deciding that fate could be changed. The galaxy was learning to be human. As the combined fleet began the long journey back to their scattered homes, Kethtar reflected on how far they had all come from that moment when 12 human ships had charged into impossible odds. The humans had planted a seed of something that transcended species, culture, and even biology itself. The understanding that meaning could be found in sacrifice, that courage was a choice rather than an instinct, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny was simply refusing to accept it as normal. The war was far from over. The hegemony still controlled vast territories, and the Devourers remained a threat to everyone. But something fundamental had changed in the galaxy's equation. The oppressed had learned that they could choose their fate. The oppressors had learned that fear was not an infinite resource, and everyone had learned that sometimes the weakest could become the strongest simply by refusing to accept that weakness was permanent. The humans had given the galaxy its greatest gift, not technology or weapons or even victory, but the knowledge that transformation was always possible, that any being, any species, any civilization could choose to become something better than what they were. And in the depths of space, among the wreckage of the greatest battle in galactic history, that knowledge continued to spread like ripples on a cosmic pond, touching shores that had never known the possibility of hope. 1 year after the fall of Titan Station, Kethtar stood in the observation deck of New Kepler Station and watched something that should have been impossible. Former enemies working together to build a future none of them could have imagined. The space around the station buzzed with activity that defied every principle of galactic politics that had governed civilization for millennia. Zalani warships shared patrol routes with reformed Devourer bioships. Kithra navigators guided hegemony refugees to safety, while Threx engineers worked alongside former Valdari slaves to construct new defensive platforms. Most remarkably of all, humans were everywhere. Captain Sarah Chen's sacrifice at Kepler had become legend, but humanity itself had survived and thrived in ways that amazed even Kethtar. The species that had seemed destined for extinction had instead become the galactic community's conscience, their representatives serving as mediators, peacekeepers, and advisors wherever conflicts arose. The station itself was a testament to human influence. Built in the orbital space where the original battle had taken place, it served as both memorial and symbol of what could be accomplished when beings chose cooperation over conquest. The central memorial hall contained fragments of the 12 human ships that had started it all, arranged in a pattern that caught and reflected light from the system star. But Kethtar wasn't here to admire the symbolism. He was here because something was coming that would test everything the galaxy had learned about courage, sacrifice, and hope. The core Devourers were moving. For over 50,000 years, the Devourers that the galaxy knew, the ones they called the Hunters, had been merely the advanced scouts of something far more terrible. In the galactic core, protected by radiation fields and gravitational anomalies that made travel nearly impossible, lived the original Devourer collective. They had been content to let their scattered children spread across the spiral arms, consuming and growing stronger while they pursued projects of unimaginable scope and ambition. The success of the rebellion, the conversion of some Devourers into Seekers, and the growing cooperation between former prey species had finally attracted their attention. The core collective was coming to reclaim their wayward children and restore the natural order of predator and prey. The intelligence had come from thinking of others before self and the other Seekers. Their bioneural connection to the greater Devourer consciousness meant they could sense the approach of their progenitors across vast distances. What they shared with the galactic community was terrifying in its scope. The core collective consisted of over 1 million bioships, each one larger and more powerful than the strongest vessels in the Hunter fleets. They had been growing and evolving in the galactic core for 50 millennia, feeding on the energy of black holes and the matter of entire star systems. They were no longer just ships. They were mobile worlds, living planets capable of consuming everything in their path. Worse, they were learning from the conflicts they had observed. The core collective had studied the human sacrifice, the rebellion it had inspired, and the psychological warfare that had proven so effective against the hegemony. They were adapting, developing countermeasures, preparing to face an enemy that fought with hope rather than fear. The galaxy had perhaps 6 months before the core fleet reached the outer territories. 6 months to prepare for a war against enemies that viewed entire species as resources to be harvested. The response to this news revealed just how much the galaxy had changed since the Battle of Kepler. Instead of panic or despair, the various species and factions began to coordinate with an efficiency that would have been impossible under the old order. The new Galactic Assembly, formed in the wake of the hegemony's collapse, became a genuine governing body rather than just a debating society. Representatives who had spent centuries as enemies found themselves working 18-hour days to organize a defense that transcended every previous boundary of politics, biology, and philosophy. The humans, as expected, were at the center of it all. Admiral Sarah Chen's daughter, Lieutenant Commander Maria Chun, had followed her mother into military service but had become something entirely different, a strategist who specialized in impossible victories. At 28 years old, she was already recognized as one of the greatest tactical minds in galactic history, not because she could win conventional battles, but because she understood how to turn defeat into victory through the alchemy of inspiration. Maria had studied every detail of her mother's final battle, not to mourn but to learn. She understood that the 12 ships hadn't won through superior firepower or brilliant tactics. They had won by changing the rules of engagement, by refusing to accept that mathematical odds determined outcomes. Now, she proposed to do the same thing on a galactic scale. "We can't fight them," she explained to the assembled representatives, her presentation hologram showing the size comparison between the core fleet and the combined forces of the galactic community. Not in any conventional sense. Even if every ship, every weapon, every warrior in the galaxy worked in perfect coordination, we'd be outnumbered 1,000 to 1 by enemies that have had 50,000 years to prepare for this moment. The assembly hall fell silent. These were beings who had learned to hope, who had discovered that courage could triumph over fear, but the mathematics were undeniable. The core collective represented a level of threat that made all previous conflicts seem like minor skirmishes. However, Maria continued, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence that her mother had shown in the face of impossible odds. We're not going to fight them the way they expect. We're going to do what humans have always done when faced with insurmountable challenges. We're going to change what victory means. Her plan was simultaneously brilliant and insane, requiring a level of coordination and sacrifice that would have been unthinkable before the Galactic Awakening. Instead of trying to destroy the core collective, they were going to save it. The intelligence gathered by the Seekers had revealed something crucial about the core collective psychology. They were the original devourers, the template from which all others had been created. They had evolved beyond individual consciousness into a unified collective that made decisions based on pure logic and efficiency. They consumed because consumption led to growth, and growth was the logical response to existence. But they had never encountered the concept of willing sacrifice. The plan required volunteers from every species, every faction, every world in the galaxy. Not soldiers for a final battle, but messengers for a different kind of war. They would meet the core collective not with weapons, but with examples, showing them through direct experience what the humans had taught the galaxy. That strength could come from giving rather than taking, that evolution could proceed through cooperation rather than consumption, that existence could have meaning beyond mere survival and growth. The volunteers came forward in numbers that amazed even Kethtar. Former hegemony officials who had spent their careers oppressing others now offered to risk their lives to save them. Zalani warriors who had dedicated themselves to vengeance chose instead to pursue redemption. Threx miners who had known only exploitation volunteered to demonstrate the power of freely given service. Most moving of all were the Seekers. Every devourer who had joined their faction volunteered immediately, understanding that they would be returning to face the source of their existence, with a knowledge that they had chosen to become something different than what they were created to be. Thinking of others before self spoke for all of them. Core Collective made us to consume and grow. We learned from humans to give and help grow others. Now we show our makers that their children found better way. Maybe they learn too. Maybe they choose to become like us. The logistics of the operation were staggering. Thousands of ships from across the galaxy converged on the route the Core Collective would take, positioning themselves at carefully calculated intervals. Each vessel carried representatives of multiple species, living examples of the cooperation and sacrifice that had transformed galactic civilization. The plan was for each ship to make contact with the Core Collective individually, broadcasting not just words, but living proof of what the galaxy had become. They would share their stories, their choices, their transformations. They would show the Core Collective that evolution could take paths other than simple growth and consumption. Most of them would die in the attempt. The Core Collective was unlikely to be immediately convinced by philosophical arguments, no matter how eloquently presented. But each death would be meaningful, each sacrifice would carry a message, and perhaps, if the humans were right about the power of hope over fear, the accumulated weight of their examples would eventually tip the balance. Kethtar had volunteered for the first contact mission, commanding a ship crewed by representatives of 17 different species. As they took their position along the Core Collective's projected route, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been an immortal observer, dedicated to neutral documentation and immune to the emotions that drove other species to greatness and folly. Now he was a participant, a believer, and, if the plan failed, quite possibly one of the first victims of the most powerful force the galaxy had ever faced. The change still amazed him. The humans had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing, a sense of purpose beyond mere existence, a reason to care about outcomes rather than just recording them. The Core Collective appeared on their sensors like a wall of living darkness, their bioships so massive that they distorted space around them simply by existing. The lead vessels were the size of moons, their hulls pulsing with energy patterns that hurt to look at directly. Behind them came rank after rank of smaller ships, each one still larger than the most powerful vessels in the galactic navy. But Kethtar felt no fear as they approached. Fear had been replaced by something stronger, hope tempered with purpose, courage refined through understanding, and the absolute certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice. The first communication came as expected, a demand for surrender followed by the beginning of what should have been a feeding process. The core collective's bioships began extending tendrils toward Kethtar's vessel, preparing to drain it of energy and absorb its matter into their own mass. Instead of resisting or fleeing, Kethtar's crew did something that had never been attempted in the long history of Devourer encounters. They opened their ship's hull and welcomed the tendrils inside. The effect on the core collective was immediate and profound. Instead of finding the terror and despair they expected, the bioship encountered willing sacrifice. Instead of taking by force, they found beings offering themselves freely. Instead of consumption driven by fear, they experienced the gift of choice. For the first time in 50,000 years, the core collective paused. The pause lasted only seconds, but it was enough. In that moment of uncertainty, of questioning, of wonder at something that contradicted every principle they understood, the core collective became vulnerable to the most dangerous force in the galaxy: hope. Kethtar smiled as the biotendrils made contact with the ship's systems. The core collective was about to learn what he had learned in watching 12 human ships charge into impossible odds. Sometimes the greatest strength came not from taking, but from giving, not from consuming, but from being consumed for a purpose greater than survival. The real battle for the galaxy's future was about to begin, and it would be fought not with weapons, but with the power of transformation itself. 5 years later, Kethtar stood in the memorial gardens of New Earth, watching children play among sculptures that told the story of how the galaxy had learned to be human. The transformation had taken 3 years of patient contact, countless sacrifices, and miracles that defied every principle of biological and political science. The core collective hadn't been defeated. They had been converted, one bioship at a time, through the accumulated power of willing sacrifice and demonstrated love. The process had begun with Kethtar's first contact mission. When the core collective's biotendrils had invaded his ship, expecting to find the familiar patterns of fear and resistance, they instead encountered something that challenged their fundamental understanding of existence. The crew had opened themselves completely to the feeding process, sharing not just their energy, but their memories, their hopes, their reasons for choosing sacrifice over survival. The effect had been like introducing a virus of consciousness into a system that had operated on pure logic for millennia. The bioship that had absorbed Kethtar's vessel found itself experiencing emotions it had no framework to understand. Fear, yes, but also love. Hunger, certainly, but also the desire to nurture rather than consume. Growth through consumption, but also growth through cooperation. The infected bioship had tried to share its confusion with the greater collective, inadvertently spreading the emotional contamination to other vessels. Within hours, entire sections of the core fleet were experiencing doubt, wonder, and the terrifying possibility that their purpose might be something other than endless consumption. The second contact ship, crewed by former hegemony officials led by a human diplomat named Dr. Elizabeth Vargas, had been absorbed by a bioship already struggling with these new concepts. Dr. Vargas and her crew had spent their final hours not fighting the absorption process, but explaining it, helping the collective understand what it was experiencing. "You're feeling empathy," Dr. Vargas had transmitted as her ship's hull dissolved around her. "It's the ability to care about others as much as you care about yourself. Your children, the Seekers, discovered it when they learned from us. Now you could discover it too." By the time the third contact ship approached, the core collective was actively seeking to understand what was happening to them. The bioship that absorbed Commander Maria Chin's vessel did so with something approaching gentleness, trying to preserve the crew's consciousness long enough to learn from their experiences. Maria had used those precious extra moments to share something that changed everything: the memory of her mother's final battle. The core collective experienced, through Maria's memories, the moment when 12 human ships had charged into impossible odds, not for conquest or survival, but for the simple reason that 8 million strangers needed time to escape. They felt the fear, the determination, the absolute certainty that some things were worth more than individual existence. For beings that had evolved beyond individual consciousness, the concept was revolutionary. They had achieved unity through the elimination of individual will, but the humans had shown them a different path. Unity achieved through the willing sacrifice of individual will for the benefit of others. The transformation accelerated after that. Bioships began breaking away from the collective, not in rebellion, but in exploration of this new way of being. They approached the waiting contact vessels not to consume, but to communicate, seeking to understand how individual consciousness and collective purpose could coexist. The breakthrough came when thinking of others before self volunteered to allow a core bioship to absorb them completely. As the two devourer forms merged, they created something unprecedented, a being that retained individual consciousness while also maintaining connection to the greater whole, capable of both independent thought and collective action. The hybrid entity became the bridge between the old collective and the new possibility. It could translate concepts that had no equivalent in pure collective consciousness, helping the core understand that diversity of thought strengthened rather than weakened group purpose. Within months, the entire core collective was voluntarily undergoing transformation. Some bioships chose to maintain their connection to the group mind while developing individual personalities. Others chose to separate entirely, becoming independent entities allied with but not controlled by their former collective. A few chose to merge with other species entirely, creating hybrid forms that represented the ultimate expression of cooperation over consumption. The process hadn't been without cost. Thousands of volunteers had died in the contact missions, their sacrifices adding to the accumulated weight of example that finally convinced the core collective to choose transformation over destruction. The galaxy mourned them as heroes, but Kethtar knew they had achieved something more valuable than heroism. They had proven that love was stronger than fear, that hope was more powerful than despair, and that the willing gift of life could overcome any force that sought to take it. The political transformation of the galaxy had followed the biological one. The new Galactic Assembly had evolved from an emergency council into a genuine democratic federation, with representatives chosen not by military strength or economic power, but by their species' commitment to the principles that the humans had demonstrated: courage, sacrifice, and the absolute value of individual choice. The humans themselves had become something unique in galactic civilization, a species that was simultaneously influential and humble, powerful and self-effacing. They served as mediators, teachers, and occasionally gentle critics when other species began to lose sight of the principles that had saved them all. Maria Chun had become the first human to serve as Galactic Assembly President, elected unanimously not because she was human, but because she embodied the qualities that all species now aspired to develop. Her inaugural address had been simple but profound. "We are here not to rule, but to serve, not to take, but to give, not to survive, but to help others thrive. This is what my mother and her crew taught us, and this is what we must never forget." The Watchers had undergone their own transformation. No longer content to observe from the sidelines, they had become the galaxy's historians and teachers, helping new species understand the lessons of the past, while documenting the ongoing miracle of cooperative evolution. Kethtar himself had become something unprecedented, a watcher who participated in the events he recorded, recognizing that some truths could only be understood from within. The former hegemony territories had been reorganized into voluntary associations, with former oppressor species working alongside those they had once enslaved to build something better than either had achieved alone. The process hadn't been perfect. There had been conflicts, misunderstandings, and moments when the old patterns of dominance and submission had reasserted themselves. But each crisis had been met with patience, forgiveness, and the gentle reminder that transformation was a choice that had to be made again and again. Even the Devourers, both the converted Seekers and the transformed core collective, had found new purposes. Some had become explorers, using their ability to survive in hostile environments to map dangerous regions of space and establish safe routes for other species. Others had become guardians, protecting younger civilizations from the threats that still existed in the galaxy's darker corners. A few had chosen the most remarkable transformation of all. They had become nurturers. Former consumer species had learned to create rather than destroy, to give life rather than take it, to measure their success not by what they acquired but by what they helped others achieve. The memorial gardens where Kethtar stood were themselves a symbol of this transformation. Built on what had once been a barren moon, they had been created through the cooperation of dozens of species, each contributing their unique abilities to create something beautiful and living. Former Threx miners had shaped the landscape, Kithra navigators had designed water features that reflected the movement of stars, and converted devourers had contributed bioformations that turned sunlight into art. At the center of the gardens stood a simple monument, a fragment of hull plating from the UES Defiance, Captain Sarachen's ship. The plaque beneath it bore words in 100 languages, but the meaning was universal. They charged into the impossible and made it inevitable. Children from across the galaxy played in the gardens, their games reflecting the values that their parents had learned from humanity. They played not at war, but at rescue, not at conquest, but at cooperation, not at survival, but at sacrifice for others. They were growing up in a galaxy where courage was normal, where hope was expected, and where the idea that individuals might be worth less than the groups they belonged to was as alien as the notion that the strong had an obligation to prey upon the weak. Watching them, Kethtar reflected on the journey that had brought the galaxy to this point. It had begun with 12 human ships charging into impossible odds, continued with species after species choosing transformation over surrender, and culminated with the most powerful force in galactic history learning to love instead of consume. But he knew the story wasn't over. It would never be over because the choice between fear and hope, between taking and giving, between surviving and thriving, was one that every individual and every species would have to make again and again for as long as consciousness existed in the universe. The humans had taught the galaxy that this choice was possible. They had shown that circumstances didn't determine character, that mathematical odds didn't dictate outcomes, and that the willingness to sacrifice for others could overcome any force that relied on fear and domination. Most importantly, they had proven that transformation was always possible. Any being, any species, any civilization could choose to become something better than what they were. The capacity for courage, for love, for hope existed in every conscious entity. It just needed to be awakened by example and nurtured by choice. As the twin suns of the system set behind the memorial gardens, Kethtar began composing his final entry in the chronicle he had been writing for 5 years. It will be transmitted across the galaxy, archived in 1,000 libraries, and studied by generations yet to come. Today I conclude my observation of the event that historians will call the Great Transformation, he wrote. What began as the sacrifice of 12 human ships has become the rebirth of galactic civilization itself. The humans taught us that fear was a choice, that courage was contagious, and that love was the most powerful force in the universe. They showed us that evolution could proceed through cooperation rather than competition, that strength could come from giving rather than taking, and that the ultimate victory was not the defeat of enemies, but their conversion into friends. The galaxy is no longer the same place it was when Captain Sarah Chun and her crew made their impossible choice. We have all learned to be a little more human, and in doing so, we have discovered what we were always meant to become, a community of conscious beings choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and meaning over mere survival. This is what I witnessed. This is what I recorded. This is what I helped to make possible. And this is what I believe will endure long after the last star burns out and the final black hole evaporates in a quantum foam. The knowledge that consciousness can choose to be beautiful, that intelligence can choose to be kind, and that any being can choose to charge into the impossible and make it inevitable. As he finished writing, Kethtar smiled, an expression that would have been impossible for a species before they learned what it meant to hope. Around him, the memorial gardens hummed with the sound of life, choosing to flourish rather than merely survive. The galaxy had learned to be human, and in doing so, it had discovered what it truly meant to be alive.